My millionaire grandfather's funeral hadn't even ended when my parents, who'd ignored me my whole life, filed a lawsuit to take everything he left me. I remember staring at the papers, half in disbelief, half in rage. But the real shock came later, inside that cold Massachusetts courtroom. My mother rolled her eyes the second I walked in like she already knew she'd win. Then the judge looked up, froze, and said, "Wait, the charges are against you." Every whisper stopped. My parents stared, confused. They had no idea who I really was or what I'd been waiting to do for years. I grew up in a house where love was measured by silence. My parents, Diane and Scott Morrison, lived 2 states away, but might as well have lived on another planet. They were the kind of people who sent postcards instead of phone calls, who showed up for Christmas only when a camera was around. When I was 3 months old, they left me with my grandparents just for a few weeks. Those weeks stretched into decades. My first memory isn't of my mother's perfume or my father's voice. It's of my grandmother, Helen's kitchen. The smell of melting butter, the soft thud of her wooden spoon against the bowl, the sound of her laugh when I spilled chocolate chips everywhere. "The best cookies have too much of everything," she'd say. She never scolded me, never sighed like I was a burden. To her, I was just enough. My grandfather, Judge William Parker, was a man carved from discipline and kindness. Every evening he'd walk in from the courthouse, still in his robe, set his briefcase down and ask, "What did my favorite lawyer in training learn today?" I'd hold up my crayon drawings, and he'd study them like legal documents. I thought that's what all families were like until I started school. Other kids had parents at soccer games, at plays, at back-to-school nights. I had 2 empty chairs and a grandmother waving twice as loud to make up for it. When I asked why my parents didn't come, Grandma said, "They're busy with important things, sweetheart." I wanted to believe her, but even at 7, I could feel the gap widening like a crack in the wall no one wanted to fix. The few times they did visit, it was always the same. Diane would arrive in designer heels, kiss the air near my cheek, and spend the whole visit scrolling through her phone. Scott would stay outside honking the car horn for her to hurry. I learned early that pretending was their favorite family tradition, but my grandparents never spoke badly of them. Grandpa used to say, "Justice isn't about revenge, Ava, it's about showing up." And he showed up for every scraped knee, every science fair, every graduation photo. When kids at school talked about inheritance or family businesses, I didn't think about money. I thought about his voice reading bedtime stories from law journals, the steady hum of the old heater in his office, and the way his eyes softened when Grandma laughed. Looking back, I see it clearly now. Love was presence, not promise. And absence. Absence was a choice. So when he died, when the will revealed, he'd left everything to me. It wasn't greed that made my parents furious. It was exposure. The money didn't humiliate them. The truth did. And they'd rather destroy me than face what they'd done. The first crack appeared on a gray Thanksgiving morning when I was 18. I'd driven home from college to surprise Grandma. She was in the garden, knees in the dirt planting tulip bulbs even though the ground was half frozen. "Spring's worth the wait," she smiled. By sunset, she was gone, collapsed between the flower beds she loved. I found Grandpa sitting there hours later, still holding her gardening gloves. He didn't cry. He just stared at the soil, whispering her name like it might answer back. We buried her 3 days later. My parents showed up late, left before the reception, and never called after. That was the day I stopped making excuses for them. After that, Sundays became sacred. Grandpa and I cooked together, his famous pot roast, my burnt cookies, and talked about law, truth, and how people hide behind appearances. He told me, "The law reveals who people really are, Ava. It strips away performance." I didn't know then how literal that lesson would become. Years passed. I graduated law school, became a prosecutor, and Grandpa watched every milestone with the same quiet pride. My parents sent a 2-line card. "Good job. Proud of you." That was their version of love. Then at 87, Grandpa died in his sleep. The house felt colder without him, like the walls missed his voice. At the reading of his will, I expected maybe his books, his watch, something sentimental. Instead, the lawyer handed me everything: the Brookline house, his savings, investments, over $3 million in total, and a sealed letter addressed only to me. It said, "You earned this not by blood, but by presence." I remember clutching that letter so tightly my hands shook. Finally, validation, not wealth. But then came the storm. 30 days later, Thomas, my colleague and closest friend, called from his office. They filed Ava. Filed what? Your parents. They're suing claiming undue influence. I actually laughed. They think I manipulated him. They're accusing me of controlling an old man for his money. That laughter turned into something sharp in my throat. Of course they were. Of course. That night, I drove to Brooklyn, unlocked Grandpa's study, and found a folder labeled Simply Payments. Inside were decades of records, monthly transfers to my parents' notes he'd written each time they asked for more. Diane requested an increase. Scott's business failing again. Page after page, over $800,000 in total. He'd known this day might come. He prepared me for it. I sat there in the dark with the folder spread across the desk and whispered, "You saw them clearly, didn't you, Grandpa?" The anger burned low, steady, and cold. They wanted to drag me into court. Good. They'd finally meet the woman they'd created. Thomas warned me the lawsuit would get ugly, but even he didn't know how far they'd go. Within a week, headlines started popping up in local papers. Daughter accused of manipulating retired judge. The reporters didn't know my name yet, but I could feel the whispers in the courthouse halls. The same colleagues who'd once nodded at me with respect now looked away. I remember sitting in my office late one night, the only light coming from my desk lamp hum of the city far below. On my screen were the scanned filings, pages of lies dressed as grief. Ava Morrison exerted undue influence on her aging grandfather to secure control of his estate. They'd painted me as a predator, my own parents. For a moment, I almost believed their version of me. That's what family does. They convince you you're the villain for finally setting a boundary. I closed the laptop, hands shaking, and reached for the box I'd brought from Grandpa's house. Inside were the payments, the bills, the messages he'd kept meticulously. Proof of 20 years of silence disguised as dependence. I spread everything across the floor. Receipts, transfer slips, letters from my mother begging for just a little extra promises that never came true. Each page was a confession, and Grandpa had kept them all organized, labeled, dated. My pulse slowed. The chaos in my chest turned into something colder, sharper. When Thomas came by the next morning, he found me sitting on the floor surrounded by stacks of evidence. "I guess we're going to war," I said quietly. He looked around at the papers, then at me. "You really want to do this?" "I don't want to," I said. "But they do. I'm just giving them what they asked for." That week, we built our case piece by piece. Witnesses, timelines, copies of every transfer. Grandpa's handwritten notes, his emails, his medical checkups, proving he was clear-minded until the end. It wasn't revenge. It was precision. The kind of justice he taught me to believe in. Still, the nights were the hardest. Some part of me, the daughter part, still wanted them to stop, to apologize, to remember that I was their child. But that hope had died a long time ago. By the time the trial date arrived, the fear was gone. In its place was steady resolve. They wanted to face me in court. They just didn't realize whose courtroom they were walking into. The morning of the hearing, Boston was covered in sleep. The streets shimmered like broken glass. My reflection in the courthouse window looked more like a stranger than a daughter. Inside, the marble floor echoed with every step I took. Deliberate, steady. I could feel the eyes on me, the whispers. That's her, the granddaughter, being sued. When I pushed open the courtroom doors, the air was thick with perfume and tension. My mother sat in the front row, hair immaculate, lips painted soft pink. She glanced up, rolled her eyes. A long, practiced roll, the same one she'd used when I was 6 and spilled juice on her designer coat. My father stared at the floor, like a man hoping invisibility might save him. Then Judge Brennan looked up. For a second, his face was blank, just another case. And then his eyes froze. "Wait, the charges are against you," he said aloud. The courtroom stilled. Even my mother stopped pretending. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses. "Proceed." Palmer, their attorney, stood up first. Smooth voice, theatrical gestures. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is a tragedy. A devoted daughter unfairly cut out of her father's will by a manipulative granddaughter who exploited an elderly man's grief." He gestured toward my mother. Diane dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she'd chosen to match her outfit. Palmer continued, "But in his final years, he was vulnerable, confused, and isolated. My client, Mrs. Morrison, was denied the chance to reconcile. Instead, her father's estate was unjustly diverted." I sat there, hands clasped, listening. My pulse didn't spike. I smelled fabrication before the ink dried. When Palmer finished, Thomas rose. Quiet authority. "Your Honor, The evidence will show Judge William Parker was of sound mind and deliberate in his decisions. It will also show the plaintiffs, Mrs. and Mr. Morrison, received over $800,000 from him over 20 years, while visiting less than once per year. Murmurs rippled. My mother's painted calm cracked slightly. Palmer called her to the stand. "He was everything to me," she began, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I love my father dearly. We spoke often. But after his wife died, he withdrew from everyone." Thomas cross-examined. "Mrs. Morrison, according to your father's calendar, you visited 4 times in your daughter's first year. Christmas, Easter, her birthday, one Saturday in July. Is that accurate?" I was young. I don't recall exact numbers. He lifted the folder, the payments. "Your father documented each visit alongside monthly transfers to you and Mr. Morrison, over $800,000 total. Can you explain why someone manipulated would continue voluntary payments for 2 decades? Her voice cracked. "He wanted to help." Thomas leaned in. "Emotionally, you were absent. Physically, too. When was the last time you saw your father before his death?" Silence. 3 years before he died." Thomas supplied. "At his 84th birthday, 90 minutes, no cake, no photos. Correct?" She swallowed. "Yes." "So the man you love dearly died believing you were too busy to visit. Yet now you claim his fortune was rightfully yours." Palmer objected. "Argumentative?" "Sustained," Judge Brennan said softly. But his eyes never left my mother. Then came my father's turn. Thomas kept it brief. "Mr. Morrison, did you attend your daughter's high school graduation?" College." He hesitated. "We were out of town. Law school." He shook his head. Thomas projected a photo. Me in cap and gown. Grandpa in the front row clapping. Silence. "You weren't there," Thomas said. But he was. I stared at the photo, throat tightening. Not from pain, from pride. Palmer tried one last swing. "Your Honor, grief clouds judgment. My clients love their father. They were victims of manipulation." Judge Brennan nodded once. "Let's hear from the defendant." I stood. Sound of my heels against the floor echoed like a countdown. I raised my right hand, took the oath, and sat down. Thomas asked, "Miss Morrison, can you tell the court about your relationship with your grandfather?" I looked directly at my mother. "He raised me. He taught me to tell the truth even when it hurt." Palmer jumped in. "Isn't it true you benefited financially from that relationship?" "Yes," I said, "but not in the way you mean. He gave me something you can't buy, consistency. He showed up. Did I encourage him to cut his daughter out of the will? No, I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing the only family I had left." Silence. Even Palmer had no comeback. Thomas handed the judge the sealed letter Grandpa left me. Judge Brennan read it silently, face softening. "This letter alone speaks volumes." He turned to my parents. "The court finds that Judge Parker's will reflects his true and deliberate intentions. There is no evidence of manipulation, no sign of incompetence. The plaintiff's claim is without merit." The gavel struck. Case dismissed. Legal fees awarded to the defendant. My mother gasped. My father slumped. As the room emptied, she approached me, voice trembling. "Ava, please, can we talk?" "Talk about what, Diane?" "I'm your mother." I shook my head. "No, you're the woman who gave birth to me." My mother was Helen Parker. Her eyes filled, but I felt nothing, just clarity. I turned to leave, paused at the door. The courtroom lights reflected off the marble floor, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight lift. "They never knew who I really was," I whispered. Outside, the cold air hit my face. I walked down the courthouse steps, heels clicking like punctuation marks to a story finally finished. Reporters were waiting, microphones flashing like tiny weapons. I walked straight through. No statements, no victory speech, just the sound of my heels cutting through the noise. Back in my car, I finally exhaled. For the first time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. Grandpa used to say, justice was slow, but it always arrived on time. He was right. It just took 32 years. Weeks after the trial were quiet. My parents disappeared from every headline from my life, from everything. No calls, no apologies, only silence, the language they'd always spoken best. But this time it didn't sting. 3 years later, I stood behind the same bench my grandfather once presided over, now wearing his robe. Judge Ava Morrison, 39, youngest in Massachusetts history. On my first day, I touched the wooden gavel he left me and whispered, "We made it, Grandpa." Years passed. Promotions came, and so did peace. At 60, I retired. My last visit was to Mount Auburn Cemetery, where tulips bloomed around two headstones, William and Helen Parker. I knelt, planting a few new bulbs beside them. "You were right," I said softly. "Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up." And as the wind moved through the trees, I could almost hear his laugh again, steady, proud, and free. Family isn't written in bloodlines. It's proven by presence. I learned that too late to save my parents, but just in time to save myself. If you've ever had to stand up to people who were supposed to love you, tell me your story below. And don't forget to subscribe. More truths are coming.